Well, the world might be a little closer to catastrophe today after President Trump announced that he'd ordered the Pentagon to restart its nuclear weapons testing program after a break of more than 30 years. He said the tests are necessary to keep pace with China and Russia. In a statement published online, Donald Trump wrote, "Because of other countries' testing programs, I've instructed the Department of War to start testing our nuclear weapons on an equal basis. That process will begin immediately." He also spoke about this later on board Air Force One.
It had to do with others. They seem to all be nuclear testing. Russia? We have more nuclear weapons than anybody. We don't do testing. We've halted it many years ago. But with others doing testing, I think it's appropriate that we do also.
Well, despite what you heard there from President Trump, it's actually Russia that has the largest nuclear arsenal. But the US isn't far behind. China's a distant third, followed by France and the UK. Now, these are the 5 recognised nuclear weapon states. India is next, then Pakistan, Israel and North Korea, the 4 countries that haven't signed the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, which is aimed at preventing the spread of nuclear weapons. Well, the Kremlin has responded to Trump's statements. Here's President Vladimir Putin's spokesperson, Dmitry Peskov.
I want to remind you of President Putin's statement, which has been repeated many times. If someone departs from the moratorium, Russia will act accordingly.
So what's going on and where might all this testing lead? Well, William Alberque is a senior adjunct fellow at the Pacific Forum. That's a non-profit foreign policy research institute. Before that, he was director of NATO's Arms Control, Disarmament and Non-Proliferation Centre. Welcome to DW. Can we start with some fact-checking? When President Trump says they all seem to be nuclear testing, is that true? And who are they?
Well, in the broadest sense, there hasn't been a major nuclear test in quite some time. The last big nuclear test we saw was in North Korea in 2017. But there are those in the intelligence community that believe that Russia and China are doing very, very, very small nuclear tests at their facilities and trying to hide them so that no one outside the facility knows that they're happening. This appears sometimes in the US State Department's compliance report, which is an annual report that they have to do to Congress to say who's complying and not complying with arms control. So there are suspicions, and that may be what he's hearing. But at the same time, this could be about big tests of nuclear systems, like the Burevestnik, the nuclear-powered cruise missile, and the Poseidon, the Russian underwater nuclear-powered, nuclear-armed torpedo.
OK, so Trump makes this announcement. How do we expect China, Russia and North Korea to react?
I expect they'll react relatively badly. I've already seen some stuff from the Moscow press. The head of the Duma Foreign Policy Committee, other folks have been saying if the US tests, then there's going to have to be a Russian response. This could lead to chaos. And in the meantime, China is the country among those 3 that stands to benefit the most from a resumption of testing, because they haven't tested since '96, and they were testing to a very different arsenal then than the one that they have now. So they might actually benefit. So it'd be ironic if the US tests and we end up handing China an excuse to make a leap forward in technology.
All right, but just to be clear, no one says they've been testing,
Correct.
but they've still been developing weapons.
Right.
So if you don't test these nuclear weapons physically, what do you do?
So what you do is you do computer modeling, you do testing on very small levels and then extrapolate out from there, which might seem difficult, but you have to remember, at the end of the Cold War, the biggest computer in the world that helped us modeling for developing new nuclear weapons was called the Cray 2 supercomputer, and it sits out in California. The computing power of that computer is roughly that of an iPad 2.
Right.
So our computer modeling has become so much more advanced that it really means the need for testing has actually dropped over the years.
Let's take a look at the countries that have nuclear weapons. And we're going to put that up on the screen. And what we'll see is that the United States and Russia outstripping the rest of the world by multiples, with China coming in at number 3. That said, of course, pretty much anyone on that alarmingly long list that we're seeing on the screen would be able to destroy the world many times over. So, William Alberque, I guess this begs the question, does the Trump announcement inevitably mean proliferation? Will there necessarily be more nuclear weapons? or will American nuclear weapons just get better at killing everyone?
I think so. If we take the assumption that this means that the United States may test, will that lead to further proliferation in states? I think there would be countries that would say, well, if the U.S. is completely unfettered, and that's followed by Russia and China, then why are we bothering to show restraint?
Is that what that means? If the U.S. says we are going to test, the world reads that as the U.S. is just going crazy?
Correct. There's no rules left, because in 97 days from today, the New START treaty ends, and we no longer have any arms control between the U.S. and Russia for the first time since 1972. So again, I think the restraint that other countries show would probably disappear. But to the second part of your question about lethality, to be frank, there's no new science for the U.S. to learn from testing. The science is settled. We haven't found some new branch of physics that someone will learn something from a new nuclear explosion. All that'll really happen is that you'll learn how to miniaturize better, how to use less nuclear fuel in order to make an explosion. So you'd paradoxically probably make smaller and less deadly nuclear weapons, but probably a lot more of them. But ultimately, it's other countries that respect this norm that has existed. I mean, outside of North Korea, India, and Pakistan, there's been no tests in the world since '96 by the P5, US, UK, France, China, and Russia. And so if those countries feel unconstrained, then other countries will say, well, why don't we acquire nuclear weapons? Why don't we undermine the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty? Why don't we undermine the core bargain that has existed that the US and Russia will show restraint, and then the rest of the world will not proliferate?
But there are treaties at the moment, aren't there? There's the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty and the New START Control Treaty with Russia.
Right.
So where does this American announcement sit within that framework?
Right. My biggest hope is actually that this is not a signal that the U.S. will resume testing, but rather it's Trump trying to build leverage against Putin to force him into talks for a new treaty to go beyond New START. Because like I mentioned, 3 months from now, February 4th, 2026, the New START treaty ends. And so I think Trump wants to build leverage, and this may be part of that. Right. That's my best hope, is that actually what we're going to see is the U.S. and Russia engage in intense negotiations that lead to a new treaty. I would also love to see China engage. But China has absolutely refused, because they're building. They're probably going to go up to more than 1,000 within the next couple of years. And they might be trying to reach, you saw that level that the U.S. and Russia are at. They might be trying to reach that. They're building the plutonium production capability, the stuff, the nuclear fuel for bombs. They're building tons and tons of missiles, brand new missile production sites. So they may be racing as well. And so we have to get China into arms control at some point as well. So we need the US, Russia, and China to come to the table.
OK, so you have to look at lots of different things happening at once. And one of those things is 90 days' time, what is being said about those arms control treaties.
Correct.
It's also interesting to see there's been no comment from the Pentagon or the Department of Energy, which oversees the US nuclear arsenal. What does that tell us?
It's really interesting, because if the US is going to resume nuclear testing, according to the Department of Energy's document itself, it's the National Nuclear Security Agency under the Department of Energy that runs testing. And they report to Congress every year on where they are in terms of taking care of the stockpile. They estimate that it's a minimum of 6 to 10 months to do a politically significant test. In other words, a test that has no scientific capability, but would be a political display. 6 to 10 months. In order to do a real substantive test that would advance science, and again, there's very, very marginal gains, as I mentioned, for new testing, it would take between 24 to 36 months to prepare. So we're looking at 2 to 3 years, and you would have to see money, you'd have to see people, you'd have to see all kinds of changes happening before that test. It's not like they can just say, let's set one off tomorrow. I mean, they could, but that would be very, very strange and very dangerous. In order to do it right, you would need at least 6 to 10 months. Again, that would be for an insignificant shot that would just be a test for test's sake.
And what would we see if in 6 to 10 months' time there was a test? What would we see where?
So the first thing you'd see, I don't know if you know about the pizza indicator for the Pentagon. When a crisis happens, you monitor the pizza sales for delivery to the Pentagon to say when a problem is going to happen. And it's a pretty accurate measure of when Pentagon activity will take. You could say the same thing for Nevada. If you suddenly see lots and lots of vehicles moving
Nevada is where this would happen.
Correct. The Nevada National Nuclear Security Site, which is 100 kilometers northwest of Las Vegas on Route US 95. That's where any nuclear test would occur in the United States. There's nowhere else The U.S. previously has done some weird tests out in the Aleutian Islands or elsewhere in Arkansas. But if it's going to happen today, it can only happen there at the NNSS, the Nevada National Nuclear Security Site. So you would see a huge influx of activity at that site, including people, equipment, all kinds of trucks, all kinds of aircraft, everything. And then prior to the test, they would have to declare a giant no-fly zone anywhere near the site. So you would see these developments occurring. And that's what a lot of people in open source will be watching now, is does this mean there's a huge uptick in activity at the Nevada test site? Or is this just rhetoric, again, leverage? We'll see.
I feel strangely calmed and worried at the same time. William Alberque from the Pacific Forum, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Well, let's explore this with Sir Lawrence Freedman, who's Emeritus Professor of War Studies at King's College London and one of Britain's leading military historians. He joins us from London. Welcome to DW. Let's start with your reaction to this news.
It's very peculiar. It's peculiar in a number of respects. First, nobody else is testing nuclear weapons at the moment. Not the actual warheads. There hasn't been any testing by anybody since the 1990s. Secondly, it's not the Department of Defense, or War as he now calls it, that is responsible for testing. It's the Department of Energy. So the assumption is that Trump is responding to some saber rattling by President Putin, where he talked about sort of a nuclear propelled torpedo, but nuclear propulsion is not the same thing as a nuclear warhead. So I'm not sure if anything actually will come from this.
Right.
The United States doesn't need to test nuclear weapons particularly. It knows how they work without doing this.
OK, so let's take the president at his word for now. He gives the order to resume testing today. How long before those tests could actually happen, and where would they happen?
Well, the US has got a number of old testing ranges which haven't been used for a long time. I think it will take a number of months, even longer, before they're ready to use them. But these are underground. I mean, so we're not talking about atmospheric tests, which were of course still banned by the 1963 test ban treaty. The underground tests are not wholly banned. There was a comprehensive test ban treaty in 1996, but that was not ratified by the United States. And Russia sort of de-ratified it in 2023. But nobody's really thought that this is a useful way to spend money and time since the 1990s. OK,
but if Donald Trump does this, if this happens, do you anticipate others following his lead?
That's the risk, of course. The United States has got supercomputers which simulate nuclear explosions, which can work out how weapons are likely to work. Other countries may not feel the same way. So there's a risk that he opens the door for other countries to follow suit. If he leads, the ambiguity is the sort of a tit-for-tat element in what he said. So if he believes somehow these tests have already taken place and the US must respond and he initiates a new round of testing, then sure, there's a risk that others will then follow it. But particularly, I think people would be looking at Russia. But Russia, too, would take a long time before they were able to safely mount a nuclear test. And
so if these tests start, explain to us why that's a dangerous thing.
I mean, they're not particularly dangerous as episodes in themselves, as events in themselves. It symbolizes the deterioration in relations. It means that we've got fewer restraints on nuclear activities than we used to have. There's really only one major arms control treaty left, in addition to the 1963 test ban treaty, which is a New START, which so far is just about holding. But it means the sort of ideas of mutual restraint that took hold in the 1970s and were strengthened as a result of the end of the Cold War are loosening. So in that sense, it's a sign of a deterioration in international relations. By themselves, they provide a bit of information to weapons designers, a way of testing the reliability of existing arsenals. But there's no doubt that as things stand, both sides are capable of unleashing nuclear terror on the other.
Donald Trump argues that renewed testing strengthens deterrence. Does history support that assertion?
I think deterrence is perfectly strong without the need for nuclear testing. I mean, testing was very prominent in the 1950s and into the 60s, and it was seen then as a way of demonstrating strength. When the Soviet Union felt at its weakest in 1961, when it was clear that the US was moving ahead in the missile race, an enormous weapon, far bigger than any could ever be used. The 50 megaton weapon was unleashed by the Soviet Union to demonstrate its strength. So there's a history of this. By and large, I think these have marginal impact in the way that people look at nuclear war, because it doesn't take very much to knowledge of the situation to be aware that nuclear war would be horrendous and catastrophic, and that idea is pretty well embedded. So I think, as I say, I think the danger is political more than anything else, and it represents another stage in the deterioration of international relations. If it's followed up, and as I've indicated, I'm not wholly convinced it will be.
And if it is followed up, what does a nuclear test look like?
Well, it doesn't look like very much because it's underground. So it's a big explosion underground, which is recorded on seismographs. So we know of nuclear tests. I mean, the ones that you're showing on screen are atmospheric tests, so we all know what they look like, with the big mushroom cloud. But the ones that have taken place since 1963 have been underground, in big caverns, and with lots of instruments picking up their effect, but they're nothing like the sort of explosions you're showing on screen.
All right, good to know. Thanks for talking us through that. Sir Lawrence Freedman, Emeritus Professor of War Studies at King's College London. Thank you so much.
Very much.
For more, let's bring in Juri Rescheto, who's head of our Riga bureau in Latvia. That's where DW reports from now after being banned from Russia. Good to see you, Juri. So let's clear this up. Trump says he wants to resume nuclear weapons testing because other countries are also doing it. But Russia says its previous tests were with non-nuclear weapons, but that they might now start testing nuclear weapons. Can you tell us more about all of this?
Well, Peskov said actually two things, Anya. The first one was, we hope President Trump was correctly informed, which means Russia hasn't carried out any nuclear tests yet, actually. And the second was what you said, Russia would be ready to change its mind if the others do so. I think Moscow probably didn't see Trump's reaction coming. It was fast and pretty intense. Now they're trying to, let's say, smooth things over. Peskov's doing a bit of damage control. He's basically saying, hey, we're not the bad guys here. Totally different vibe from ex-President Medvedev, by the way, who's always out there playing the tough guy and saying wild stuff. But Peskov, he's going for the reasonable look. He's like, we hope Trump got the right info, meaning we are not doing any nuclear tests, despite what Putin might have said. But then he adds a little warning, if the US starts testing again, Russia is ready to jump in too. So yeah, it's kind of, we're chill unless you are not message.
So they're in damage control, you're saying, but do they have a strategy here?
Well, it looks like Russia is trying to play a double game here, so to say. On one hand, they want to scare and confuse the West, including the US, of course. And on the other, they don't want to mess up with recent improving of relations with Washington. Moscow still sees Donald Trump as someone they can work with, maybe cut deals on Ukraine, shake up Europe a bit, and come out stronger. Basically, they want to use Trump to their advantage. That's why Peskov is out there saying, nope, we haven't done any nuclear tests. He's trying to calm things down. That seems to be strange, as Putin had mentioned two tests, one with Burevestnik missile and one with Poseidon underwater drone, both supposedly nuclear tests, but Peskov's like, no, those weren't actual nuclear tests. Which makes you wonder, if you are testing a missile with a nuclear warhead, how is that not a nuclear test? So who is telling the truth here, Putin or Peskov? All in all, I think the Kremlin's trying to look tough without looking like the bad guys, and they are trying not to tick off Trump too much. Basically, it's all about keeping the door open, maybe for future deals.
Thanks for clearing that up for us, Juri. That's DW's Juri Rescheto in Riga.